In the last few lectures, we've been primarily talking about the cognitive features of the human mind that draw it towards religious beliefs, that make religious beliefs, for lack of a better word, thinkable. In this lecture, we're going to look at how the mind is motivated towards religious beliefs. So not why it can think religiously, but why it wants to. Now, that we're motivated to think religiously in order to somehow make us feel better was an idea that was forcefully argued by one of history's most famous critics of religion, the Viennese psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. In his The Future of an Illusion, Freud argued that religion is a form of wish fulfillment, an outgrowth of the security and longing that a child feels for his or her father. The harsh realities of life and of nature, and perhaps above all of our mortality, made the pull of that illusion that much more comforting. Now, this is admittedly a belittling view of religion and of religious adherence, but the question is there any truth to that? Now, Freud's book was published in 1927, and it would be 70 more years before social psychology had matured to the point where it could empirically test those ideas. Now, before we get to those tests, we're going to take a pit stop at the famous masterwork, The Denial of Death, by the neo-Freudian anthropologist Ernest Becker. Now, The Denial of Death is a brilliant but utterly depressing book. To understand why it's so depressing, it might be just as important to understand the context under which it was written as the content of the book itself. Now, Ernest Becker wrote the book while he was at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, British Columbia, just a few kilometers away from here. And by the time he arrived there, he'd already become a bit of an academic outcast. So he was fired from his first position at Syracuse, and then ended up in squabbles with the administration at Berkeley and at San Francisco State University. So by the time he arrived at the functionally minimalist but arguably depressing concrete campus of Simon Fraser University in 1969, he seemed to have finally found a group of like-minded colleagues who were receptive to his unique and interdisciplinary way of thinking. But just 3 years later, he was diagnosed with colon cancer, and within 2 years, he would be dead. And it was against that backdrop that he wrote The Denial of Death. So his argument in the book was that human culture, all of it, was the method that our species used to cope with the awareness that's unique among the animal kingdom that we were going to die. The constant fear of our own mortality led us to various attempts to both literally and metaphorically achieve immortality. We create and defend our culture as a way of ensuring that part of us lives on even as our bodies die. And religion is just one manifestation of that denial of death. In the specific case of afterlife beliefs, it's a very explicit denial. So Becker died in 1974, and a few months later, The Denial of Death was posthumously awarded the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. Like I said, depressing. But the book went on to be very, very popular. And among those who it influenced was a trio of social psychologists who sought to empirically test some of the themes that Becker brought up in the book. And so was born terror management theory, a theory that, like Becker, predicted that the fear of mortality would make people reach for literal or symbolic forms of immortality. Now, by now, there have been hundreds of papers that have all revolved around this common paradigm of taking people and somehow making salient to them the fact that they're going to die, and then looking at how that affects their attitudes and behavior. So in one of the first terror management theory experiments, the trio tested whether judges who were confronted with their own mortality became more punitive of somebody who violated the culture's moral norms. The way they did this is they had these judges assign a bail amount to a sex worker who had been arrested for solicitation. And what they found is that those judges who had just been led to think about their own death set a level of bail that was twice as high as the judges who had been left undisturbed. So this was one of the first studies to show that confronting your own mortality leads you to attempt to defend your culture. So in one of the more famous follow-up experiments, they brought students into the lab and gave them a bunch of tools to accomplish a particular task. In one of the tasks, the only solution was to use a crucifix that had been provided to hammer a nail into a wall. And in the other task, the only solution in order to accomplish the task was to pour ink threw an American flag which ruined the flag. And what they found is that those students who'd been previously made to think about their own death took longer to arrive at the solution that required them to desecrate a sacred or patriotic symbol. And in yet another study, students who had just confronted their own mortality were more likely to aggress against a cultural outgroup member. And they did that by giving students the opportunity to feed some amount of hot sauce to somebody that they knew did not like spicy food. What about religion? Well, there have been a few experiments that have directly tested how confronting one's own mortality changes one's attitudes about religion. So in 2009, Ara Norenzayan and Ian Hansen conducted a study where they gave people the typical mortality salience prime, which involves writing about what's physically going to happen to your body when you die. And then they had another group, a control condition, that didn't complete that prime. And what they found is that in the control condition, when asked about their level of belief in God, people indicated about a 5 out of 7. But in the group that had just thought about their death, the average score was a 6.5. Now, they replicated that finding in a few interesting ways, ensuring, for example, that the effect wasn't due to just feeling bad, but to thinking about death specifically. In one of the more interesting follow-up studies, the authors looked not at whether mortality salience could increase people's belief in the culturally familiar God, so the biblical God for Christians, but whether it could do so for a culturally foreign supernatural agent. And it turns out it does. Christians, under mortality salience, were shown to increase their belief even in shamanic spirits from Russia. It turns out we find solace where we can. Now, is mortality salience powerful enough to turn avowed atheists into God-fearing believers? Here, the results get particularly interesting. So you've probably heard the expression, there are no atheists in foxholes, suggesting that in times of mortal vulnerability, everyone reaches for God. Now, it's not true. There have been many examples of atheists in wartime who've emerged just as non-believing afterwards as they did when going in. But there is some evidence to suggest that being confronted with one's own mortality does move the needle a little bit, at least implicitly. So in 2012, Jonathan Zhang and his colleagues conducted one of these mortality salience experiments on a sample of Christian participants and on non-believing participants. And the researchers measured religious belief in a couple of different ways. One was just through an explicit self-reported supernatural belief scale, so asking about your beliefs in God, heaven, etc. The second method they used was actually based on a task that my colleagues and I had developed years prior that used people's reaction times to get at their level of unconscious belief in God. Now, when looking at the explicit results, both the religious and non-religious participants became more extreme of whatever it was that they'd believed before. But for the implicit task, the results were different. There, mortality salience increased people's implicit expression of belief, regardless of whether they had previously identified as religious or not. In other words, to the extent that this task actually measured people's deep down beliefs, mortality salience made non-religious people report less belief, but actually implicitly believe more. Now, this research really bears out what both Becker and Freud before him had speculated. In the face of the terror of death, humans placate themselves by reaching out for cultural stories that deny death. Now, Becker really hitched his theory to the motivation to palliate the fear of death specifically. But recently, a number of theorists, like psychologists Jordan Peterson or Steve Heine, have argued that humans are destabilized by more than just our own mortality. The world is frightening not just because we have these fragile mortal bodies, but because it's chaotic and it's unpredictable and it's unfair and things seem to happen for no reason at all. And in this chaos, the mind is motivated to reach for more than just immortality. It's motivated to reach for order and coherence and meaning. Now, there's interesting evidence that for many, religion sates this motivation for meaning by bringing order to a chaotic world. Aaron Kay and his colleagues have shown that simply thinking about a time when one was not in control is enough to spur people to increase their belief in a controlling God. In another study, Kay and his colleagues investigated what happens to our religious beliefs when our confidence in another external source of control, the government, was undermined. Canadian students were split into two groups. One of those groups was told that the structure of the government was stable, and the other was told that the abolition of some significant political parties loomed, and that threatened to undermine the entire stability of the system. That latter group, having their faith in a controlling government threatened, showed an increase in their belief in a controlling God. So for one hot minute, Kay had turned good socialist Canadians into small government God-fearing Americans. It's no wonder then that the parts of the world that have the least stable governments also happen to have the most religious people. In one of their most elegant experiments, Kay and his colleagues asked Malaysians about their beliefs both in the stability of the government and in a controlling God at two different points. One was 2 weeks prior to a national election, and one was 2 weeks afterwards. As predicted by their model, before the election, when things were more uncertain, people were both less confident in their government and more confident in their belief in a controlling God. In other words, in the face of uncertain secular control, people compensated with increased belief in religious control. And actually, Kay calls this the compensatory control model. We compensate for our lack of control by searching for control elsewhere. Anything to protect us from the feeling of being unmoored in a chaotic and random world. Social neuroscientists have also found evidence of this palliative function of religion in the brain. Alexa Tullett and Mickey Inzlicht, both at the University of Toronto, have done some fascinating work on what they've ambitiously called existential neuroscience. Tullett and Inzlicht's work is based on looking at a particular brain signature that maps onto the sense of having our ordered view of the world destabilized. And so here I need to introduce two pieces of terminology. One is part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. Now, that's a small part of the brain that's located about 2 or 3 inches behind the center of your forehead. The ACC is involved in a lot of things, but one of its key functions is as an error detection device. So it's an alert system that tells you that something is amiss, that something wrong has happened with the way you expected things to unfold. Now, activity in the ACC can be measured using electrodes that are attached to the surface of the scalp and measure a particular brainwave that's been called the ERN, or the error-related negativity. Now, an ERN is a spike in the brainwaves that occurs about 50 to 100 milliseconds following an error in the environment. And so one common way that this is measured is using what's called the Stroop task. Now, the Stroop is a task that psychologists invented ages ago, which requires a participant to read what's written in a particular word while ignoring the color of the text that the word is written in. The problem is that the words are names of colors. And so you might have the word red that's written in blue, and you have to say red, not blue. And when you make an error in that task, when you say blue instead of red, then you can see the ERN spike in your pattern of brainwaves. So the ERN has been called the brain's distress signal, alerting us that our coherent view of how the world works has been momentarily violated. So people suffering from anxiety disorders, whose error detection system is seemingly really ramped up, have higher ERN amplitudes. And if you put those people on anti-anxiolytic medication, the amplitude shrinks. The same thing happens when you're drunk. So Tullett and Inzlicht hypothesized that religion might serve a similar function. If it is the case that religion provides existential security, might we not see evidence of that security with a neural signature in the form of a reduced ERN? And they found broad support for this. First, religious people tend to have lower ERNs than do non-religious people. And the more religious they are, the lower their ERNs. Now that's supportive of their hypothesis, but there could be multiple reasons for it. Correlation, as you know, does not necessarily imply causation. So we can't be sure that it's the religion that is causing that reduced ERN rather than some other associated variable. So the researchers designed an experiment which tried to activate religion in the moment. And they did this using something called religious priming, something that we'll talk about extensively in a later lecture. So they used a task that my colleagues and I had developed a few years earlier, in which half the sample's attention is drawn to or primed with religious beliefs, whereas the other half does not receive that task, and as a result can serve as a control condition. What they found is that when religious people have their attention drawn towards religion in the moment, their ERNs are further diminished. That is, their distress signal is turned down, and they find errors that are detected in the environment to be less affecting. They interpreted these results as suggesting that something about religion is able to counteract the feelings of anxiety that emerge from being left at the mercy of a chaotic and an unpredictable world. That element of religion is able to offer some form of existential meaning that makes the unpredictability of the world less distressing, something that is even detectable at the fundamental level of brain waves. All of these lines of evidence, from terror management theory to the compensatory control model to existential neuroscience, support this argument that aspects of religion do indeed foster some form of existential security. And that might be why we tend to see religion thrive in places of conflict and hardship and fade away in places where life is easy. When you already have security, there is less need for the special type of security that is offered by religion. Now, many have criticized Freud's perspective on religion as being overly simplistic, and I think that's a fair criticism. It's not that Freud's view of religion was necessarily wrong, but it was incomplete. It appears that existential security is a real feature of religion, but that's not all religion is about. Religions contain beliefs that tend to deny death and to placate chaos, but that's not all they contain. And different elements of religion serve different functions. In the next two modules, we'll see that many features of religion, and many features of afterlife belief specifically, do much more than just deny death and ease existential security. In fact, one of the common retorts to this motivated existential explanation for religion is that many religious beliefs aren't reassuring at all. But before we get there, let's consider this question. Amid all these cognitive and motivational features that push the human mind towards becoming religious, how is it that some people become non-religious? And that's what we're going to talk about in the next lecture.